one reason why I give this seminar now is as a kind of companion course to my natural right course. Certain aspects of the natural right problem will not be discussed in my lecture course, and which will come up here in the discussion of Cicero. Now, I'll start from the most external. What shall we read? Now, I have a statement at the bookstore or so, but I can still repeat it. We want to read 4 writings of Cicero: the Republic, the Laws, on the ends of good and bad things, in Latin De Finibus, and the offices or duties. These are many books, and one could rightly say that's too much for one course, but with all due respect for Cicero, one could say Cicero is easier to understand than Plato or Aristotle, and therefore it is not an extraordinary risk which we are taking. On the other hand, as will appear later, it is a pity that one cannot read more of Cicero, namely his 2 writings on the nature of the gods and on divination are in a way indispensable for a proper judgment of his political doctrine too, but that would simply be too much for one course. Now I begin first with a very simple question which I address to you so that we see whether we have any common ground. Why is Cicero famous as far as political theory is concerned? Let us first try to answer this question as an introduction to the course. As you all have read the histories of political theory, or you have taken courses in it, or have acquired such knowledge in other legitimate ways. And so what is Cicero famous for as far as political theory is concerned? Cicero as a statesman is of no concern to us in this course. Now, what do you know? Don't be ashamed to say what you have learned in elementary context, perhaps. But what is he famous for in political theory? You have an answer, a suggestion of your hand, please.
He's the first, I suppose, the first universal natural law.
Yes, that is a very good answer, as far as it goes. No, I mean this. Let me put it this way. Cicero is the oldest writer of whom we have complete works who has set forth the doctrine of natural law. Yeah? Because his doctrine is older than Cicero. Even this needs a footnote, because the writings in which Cicero does set forth his doctrine, the Republican Laws, are not complete. They have been a bit destroyed in the course of the malignancy of times has done them some damage. Now that is one point. Let us use a still looser term. Cicero is the oldest classic of the higher law idea. Yes, that is one point. And then there is another consideration, which some of you may know, another crucial political doctrine of which Cicero is a classic. Well, that is the doctrine of the mixed regime. The view that the best political order is a mixture of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy is presented in Cicero's Republic. That this is an issue which one has to consider would perhaps appear from the following consideration. What Cicero says about the mixed regime is not original, just as what he says about the natural law is not original. It goes back in this form to a man called Polybius, a Greek historian about a century prior to Cicero. In the 6th book of Polybius' history, you find a presentation of the mixed regime doctrine. That is the classical doctrine. Now, there is a strict line from Polybius to Montesquieu, Spirit of Laws, where the mixed regime doctrine is taken up in a considerably modified manner. And there is a very strict and also very short line from Montesquieu to the Federalist Papers. So we are immediately where we want to. But one point must not be forgotten, incidentally, that Cicero's doctrine of the mixed regime as developed in his Republic could not have had any influence throughout the ages because Cicero's Republic was lost. It reappeared only in 1820 or so, the exact date you find in the edition, where it was discovered by a cardinal in the Vatican Library, Angelo May, and since that time, and it is fragmentary. We have, I don't believe that we have half of the book, probably less than half of the book. Good, and then there is a third point, which of a general nature. Cicero says the best regime is the mixed regime. But where do we find the best regime? That mixed regime? Rome. The same was said by Polybius. Now this leads to the following important theoretical question, because after all we are not ancient historians or concerned with the Roman constitution. And that is this. When you study the Platonic or Aristotelian political doctrine, you get a description of the best regime, without any proper names, if I may say so. The best regime is described, it is seen, well, this regime has something in common that is closer to it, that is more remote to it, but the best regime is not necessarily in existence anywhere on earth. It may be, but it is not necessary. In Polybius and Cicero, the best regime is found in an actual regime, in the Rome regime. And this raises a very important theoretical question, the question of the relation between ideal and reality, you can say. How is it possible that the ideal should become actual? As these are, I believe, the three most elementary considerations which would occur to one regarding Cicero on the basis of the common opinions. So, one more introductory point. Cicero is well known as the oldest classic of the natural law teaching, say of the higher law teaching, to use a more innocuous term. This natural law doctrine, as presented by Cicero, is, according to general opinion, which as far as I know is correct, traced to a philosophic school called the Stoics, of whom we will hear quite a bit in that course. The Stoics. Now, the Stoic school was founded after Aristotle, I believe even after the death of Aristotle. That's not so important. It was a school which presupposed the Platonic Aristotelian teaching, but regarded it as insufficient for a variety of reasons and modified it. But the basic premise, at least as far as moral political questions are concerned, are the same, the Socratic premise. Now, Cicero presents the Stoic doctrine, we can say, and yet he is not a Stoic, but even an opponent of the Stoics. You see what happened in Greek philosophy after Aristotle was this. Plato had founded a school, as you know, the academy. Aristotle had founded a school, the Lyceum or the Peripatos. And these schools transmitted the teachings of the respective masters with modifications, but still fundamentally the members of the Platonic school were Platonists and the members of Aristotle's school were Aristotelians. But then two new schools were founded because of the dissatisfaction with Plato and Aristotle. One is the Stoic school, which is characteristically not called after an individual, but it is called after the place where they met, a stoa, a kind of, what is the English translation for stoa? Porch. And the other school is called Epicurean school, after the founder, Epicurean. These two schools had a very great popular success. They're popular among the highly educated classes of the Hellenized Mediterranean world, naturally. And somehow they are characteristic of this post-Aristotelian period, both the Hellenistic and the Roman period. But then another thing took place, a kind of revolution. And this revolution took place in the Platonic Academy. Some generations after Plato, say about in the middle of the 2nd century, the Platonic Academy underwent a radical change. A change in the direction of skepticism. The Platonic Academy became skeptic. You know what skeptical means in the superficial and scholastic meaning of the term. A skeptic is a man who denies to possess the truth. He can have probable opinions, but he does not possess knowledge. Now, there is, of course, that this happened in the Platonic school is not a complete accident, because we must never forget that Socrates appears also as a man who does not possess knowledge but is only seeking. That was not a mere accident. There were other forms of skepticism that's of no interest to us now. Now, this academic skeptics, academic does not mean here, as we say, academic social science, but academic means here the skepticism of the Platonic Academy was that school to which Cicero adhered. And this school its most characteristic feature, one could say, is its rejection of Stoic dogmatism. A part of that Stoic dogmatism is the Stoic natural law teaching. The Stoic natural law teaching is based on the Stoic teaching regarding the nature of the gods and the providence exercised by the gods. The academic skeptics rejected this teaching, and therefore they rejected by implication the natural law teaching based upon the Stoic theology. Now, Cicero is an academic, and he wrote 2 books in which he presented the skeptical criticism of Stoic theology, that is in the nature of the gods and on divination. 2 writings which we cannot read here because the quarter is much too short. But the extraordinary thing is that this academic skeptic learns the character of Cicero's philosophic writings. But Cicero's work is, of course, infinitely large compared with that of Plato, for example, because you have the orations, you have the rhetorical writings, and you have the philosophical writings, and an enormous epistolary work in addition. We must limit ourselves absolutely to the philosophic writings and only to some of them. Now, Cicero's philosophic works are dialogues. This is not completely surprising because we have read dialogues prior to Cicero. For example, the Platonic dialogues. But the Ciceronian dialogues differ from the Platonic dialogues in one very simple respect. As you know, Plato never speaks of himself in any dialogue. He does mention Plato, but then someone else says Plato was ill, say when Socrates died. But Plato never says, I have heard Socrates say this kind of thing. Do you know who did this, who brought in his own ego? Xenophon, yes. Xenophon uses this technique that he says, I heard Socrates discuss this and this matter, which of course is in a way very good, because we have an eyewitness or an ear witness And so we know we have the real stuff, whereas in Plato never gives us any guarantee whether the dialogues he presents are not pure inventions of Plato, and I'm afraid they are pure inventions. But Xenophon at least claims that this is the real historical. Now Cicero brings many dialogues are dialogues in which Cicero himself is the chief speaker. As Aristotle wrote dialogues, and which are lost. But the Aristotelian dialogues seem to be the models of Cicero's dialogues. That is what I believe to remember. Cicero made a remark about his dialogues in one of his writings, in more, but one is particularly interesting. That occurs in a work called the Tusculan Disputations. The Disputations in Tusculum. Tusculum was the landed estate of Cicero. And here there occurs a famous sentence. Socrates was the first who called philosophy down from heaven and placed it in cities and even introduced it into the houses and compelled it to investigate regarding life, manners, and good and bad things. Socrates' manifold way of disputing and the variety of subject matter and the magnitude of mind was consecrated Plato's magnitude of mind consecrated this way of disputing to writings, and thus produced a variety of dissenting philosophers. They say of dissenting philosophical schools. Out of those schools, available philosophical schools, we, Cicero, have followed that school particularly, or that manner particularly, which we believe Socrates has used, namely the dialogical. Why? In order to conceal our own opinion, in order to liberate others from error, and in order to seek in every disputation what is most similar to the truth, that means what is most probable. To repeat, this Ciceronian dialogue serves these three purposes: to conceal his own opinion, not to obtrude him as an authority on us, that's to say, to liberate us from error, and in every disputation to seek what is most probable. There are other passages in Cicero to the same effect, but that is the clearest one. So this much in the way of introduction. Now, I thought that we should turn to the subject immediately, so that we can cover these many writings which we have to cover. And I prepared a discussion of the first book of the Republic, because the order in which I think we should read them is Republic Laws, that is to say the political writings proper first, and then turn to the discussion of principles in the book on the ends of good and bad things, and finally the offices, where Cicero discusses the complexities, the moral complexities which arise by virtue of the apparent conflict between the moral and the expedient, where such nice questions are discussed, whether you are entitled to advertise a bad merchandise as very good, and the great moral perplexity that on the one hand you are dishonest, on the other hand, if you do not do it, other more dishonest men will buy it from you cheaply and advertise it much more than you would. And other nice questions which deserve the attention of every thinking man. So now I turn to the first book of the Republic. Do you have the copy? Those who have should take it out. I asked the bookstore to get copies, but I hope you can get, I need my, yeah. If there is someone who, let me see whether the public is in there. No. I'm sorry, I need that copy, otherwise I would never. Yeah, as you would see if you would look at it at the first page, say in your edition, page 13, is that the beginning is missing. The beginning is missing, but we have sufficient left of Cicero's prologue to understand what's the general subject matter of the prologue. Now let me see, where does the dialogue begin? The dialogue begins on page 29 on your edition. So there are about 16 pages. The bulk of the prologue has been preserved. Now, in the prologue, Cicero discusses a problem with which you may be familiar from Plato and Aristotle. The question of the two ways of life, the active life, the practical or political life, and the contemplative life, the theoretical life. And Cicero defends the active life, the political life, against the philosophers, or against certain philosophers. That is not quite clear. Do you know what the issue is? Otherwise, you wouldn't understand what we are dealing with. Do you know what the issue is? I'm sure I see someone among you who know, but they should speak up. What is the issue? Mr. Sassin?
Well, the issue is which is the more noble life and closer to the perfection of man, or whether to have an active care, a doing activity in the sense of caring for the public, the common good, or else abstracting yourself from the common good to spend time in contemplation of the highest.
Yeah, well, the active life, the question concerns, of course, the active life on its highest level, because only there does the problem become clear. Because in a way we all have to be active, the most contemplative of us has to be active. But the active life means a life dedicated to action. And that is in the highest form the life of the statesman, the political life in the fullest sense. And now in former societies, it was perfectly intelligible if someone would say the highest activity which a man can pursue is to be the statesman in his society. I believe even today it is intelligible. I mean, if you see, for example, the simple, I should say, recognition of the dignity of the President of the United States, whoever that President may be, is still a reflection of it. I mean, we still understand it. And every respect for Gary Cooper and other great men, of course, does not completely conceal from us the fact that a man who merely acts statesman, like an actor, is not the real thing. The real thing is the statesman himself. And especially if he is a great statesman, and then there is no problem needed. Who is as famous in the Western world today as Winston Churchill? Even his paintings become famous through his trade. So we understand that. But in ancient times, there were people who said, while the active life in the highest level is something in the highest degree noble and admirable, there is a life which is still more higher, still more admirable, and that they call the life of contemplation, or the theoretical life, or the philosophical life. Again, I believe even those who know nothing of the tradition can still understand this on the basis of present-day observation. For example, today there are quite a few people, I believe, who would still say that however great a statesman may be, that, say, a true poet is in a way more important to us as living human beings than a statesman can be. At least you have heard that opinion. Now, only in classical times they did not believe that the poet as poet could possibly be that, and they said it's a philosopher. So that is a very tried summary of this issue with which Cicero deals. And Cicero takes, Plato and Aristotle had come out clearly for the supremacy of the theoretical life. Cicero takes the side of the active life. We cannot blame him for that. He was a great Roman statesman who had saved the Republic against Catiline and in other situations. And there are perhaps more serious reasons for that. Now, how does he argue? At the end of the first paragraph, which is on page 15, at the end of the first paragraph, we do this, whoever has it reads it. We do not insist on formalities. Yeah? Whoever has it reads it. The last sentence of the first paragraph on page 15.
I will content myself with asserting that nature has implanted in the human race so great a need of virtue and so great a desire to defend the common safety that the strength thereof has conquered all the allurements of pleasure and ease.
Yeah. So the starting point of Cicero we can say is this. It's the natural character of the need for virtue and of the love for the defense of the common safety. Because they are natural, they overcome often all blandishments of pleasure and leisure. If nature did not drive a man, and in particular certain men, in the direction of virtue and the common good, this would not be possible. Now, the connection between these 2 points, the need for virtue and the love for the defense of the common safety, is this, as Cicero makes clear in the sequel. The highest use of virtue is the government of the commonwealth. The highest use of virtue is the government of the commonwealth. Now, in the first place, is this statement intelligible? The highest use of virtue is the government, of course it means the good government of the commonwealth. Is this intelligible? I mean, after all, ordinary people also can be virtuous, I assume, but why is that use higher? Do we understand that? I mean, I want to avoid the impression that this is an old moralist who talked about things which have proved to be wholly meaningless by this recent advances of psychology. And let us see whether we do not understand, when we look at such matters from the non-academic point of view, from the practical point of view, whether we do not recognize what Cicero means. Why should this be the highest virtue, the virtue of the most perfect statesman, compared with the very great virtue of a perfectly virtuous housewife or schoolmaster or whatever you have? Why should it be? Yes?
Well, the possibility because the political, the state, the political is the source and the cause of virtue.
Well, also one could perhaps say what you imply is this. Somehow we think that virtue has something to do with beneficence. Yeah? With beneficence. Now, the broadest possibility of being a benefactor of one's fellow men is that of the statesman. Think of any philanthropic benefactor who establishes a hospital or many hospitals or so, and compare with what a statesman could do to help his fellow men. So that would make some sense. Now Cicero goes on to argue as follows. The statesman, yeah, but of course one thing is to say that government of a city, of a commonwealth, requires a higher degree of virtue than merely private life. And another thing is to say it is the highest virtue, meaning a higher virtue than that possessed by philosophers, because that is the issue. If you do not like the word philosophers for some reasons, of which we hope we will dispose while we go on, then say, no, intellectuals won't do, but say poets or creative artists, because it's the same issue fundamentally. It's the same issue. To our popular understanding today, the creative artist has taken the place of the philosopher, for reasons which would take us too long to explain. But at any rate, I can assume this, that even the completely uninitiated in this kind of thing knows of the fact that the two things competing for men's highest admiration are, even today, the statesman, that includes generals, by the way, it's a political man. And sometimes they can even coincide in a case, this is what Mr. Gilden, senor, statesmen and generals, and on the other hand, the creative artists. Now you see, so I make even allowance for those who prefer Clark Gable to any political man, because this man means, of course, by Clark Gable, the creative artist, you see. But more sophisticated people would go higher up and say perhaps Eliot or Hemingway, I do not know, but I know only the names. But certainly certain individuals generally regarded as creative artists, they are those who compete for the highest respect, even today. Or is my thesis wrong? Is it, or could one say perhaps that some boxer might have a higher prestige than either a distinguished statesman or general on the one hand, or a distinguished creative artist? Could one make this objection to me?
Well, I was going to say the objection that will be made today is the successful businessman is the chief.
Yeah, of this I could more easily dispose, because one could say, not entirely without reason, as a businessman belongs to the side of the statesman or the general. Yeah? You know, also that I could give some empirical proof. Charles Wilson, if you know what I mean. But still, that's still the practical. But what about boxers? Could one make this as a valid objection to what I said? That some people would really say, yeah. That is true, but still, could one not also say something else? I mean, you see, I tell you why I do not like this answer. Because it would blur the distinction. When you speak of the boxer as a creative artist, then you come also with the same reason to the parachutist, for example. Yeah? And then we come to the general and behind that other field. So for this reason I prefer another field, yes?
Well, on the same basis, I don't understand how you associate the man in the business world with the statesman, because to a man, for example, contemplating the way of life that he should follow, they would appear as two more or less distinct ways of life, and a great many people would be far more attracted to the business world as a much more
but still, it is practical. I mean, the virtue would consist of the inventiveness and the other qualities of the leading businessman would mean he's a great benefactor by deeds of his fellow men. Yeah. But what about the boxer? To meet this issue, why can one safely disregard the boxer in this connection, or the Dresser, or any other man of this kind. Why can one do that? Why is even today it clear that there are these two peaks in the ordinary social orientation? The practical man of the highest order on the one hand, and the theoretical man on the other.
A boxer was never famous.
Joe Louis.
Unless he has a poet who writes an ode.
That would be true of statesmen in the long run
But
too.
statesmen can be known without poets or before.
Their memory after their death depends on the poets or something like poets. No.
Yes.
The boxer is not a creative artist, then he must be practical in the same class as the statesman.
Yeah, on a very subordinate level. Yeah, and I mean, in other words, the cash success and this the publicity success is of course not a sufficient criteria. Yeah, because that one can prove easily if someone kills a great number of men, but an escaped convict. He also can be famous for years, fill the headlines. Yeah? We have seen that. Yes?
I think there's an assumption that the statesman and the philosopher, both using their mental capacities to the highest degree, maybe the virtue is in perfecting mental capacities, and this boxer cannot be accused of.
That is a very good point. Yeah. And that is perhaps the ultimate reason why we do that. And in spite of all other things which have happened since, the recollection of that is still alive. Yeah? That's true. That's perfectly true. That would be the old reason for that, the reason which you gave. Yes?
I was wondering why you took T.S. Eliot as the popular image rather than Freud or Einstein.
Pardon?
Why you took T.S. Eliot as the popular
All right. You see that you are perfectly right. You could have taken the theoretical man as well. That's true. But I try to make the utmost concession to those that our points of view are completely different from those of olden times. Since Einstein and Freud are certainly theoretical men, yeah? There no difficulty arises. But when you replace the strictly theoretical man, the philosopher or scientist, by the creative artist, you can say that's an entirely new point of view. And for this reason, I said that. So we see then that the issue is still intelligent. Now, how does Cicero argue then? In the first place, he says, statesmen complete by deed what the philosophers speak of in their corners. They talk and debate and discuss, but of course it doesn't reach an issue. Even if they find out something is good, that does not make it a public fact. It becomes a public fact only by legislation, of course. Now, so in other words, since admittedly, the argument is this, that is higher, which completes this thing, rather which only initiates it, and it is led to its consummation by the statesman, therefore the statesman is higher. Now, this argument could, however, mean that statesmanship presupposes philosophy. That the philosophers lay the foundation, they found out the fundamental truths regarding good and bad, and the statesman completed. Cicero says here, no. And that is, I think let us read the second paragraph on page 15.
But it is not enough to possess virtue as if it were an art of some sort, unless you make use of it. Though it is true that an art, even if you never use it, can still remain in your possession by the very fact of your knowledge of it. Yet the existence of virtue depends entirely upon its use.
By the way, is this thought clear to you? That this distinction between virtue and art, that an art not exercised is still an art. Virtue not exercised is not virtue. Is this clear?
Well, that's the same distinction Aristotle.
Yeah, sure. No, but is it illustrated?
Well, a person who doesn't act virtuously, you can't intentionally not act virtuously and say you're still a virtuous man. You just intentionally for a specific purpose.
If he never acts bravely, he cannot be a brave man. Yeah? But on the other hand, a man may never practice medicine and have a complete possession of the art of medicine. Yeah, that's good. Yes?
And its noblest use is the government of the state, the realization in fact, not in word, of those very things that the philosophers in their corners are continually dinning in our ears. For there is no principle...
Yeah, in Latin is not the realization in fact, but perfectio, which I think we could translate more strongly by the consummation, the perfection. Yeah. Yes?
For there is no principle enunciated by the philosophers, at least none that is just and honorable, that has not been discovered and established by those who have drawn up codes of law or state.
Let us stop here. You see what Cicero says. It is not so that the statesmen merely complete that to which the philosophers have laid the foundation, but the philosophers say nothing that is sound, which has not been established by political men. So that the statesmen are superior, as he says in the sequel, to the philosophers in wisdom itself. Disregarding for the time being all critical considerations, we must first understand the thesis of Cicero. Cicero's thesis, given his premises, the conclusion really follows. If what the philosophers do depends essentially on the founding acts of statesmen, and then the philosophers formulate that somehow, express it succinctly and coherently, and then this is again used for finds its consummation in the actions of statesmen again, one can rightly say that philosophy is in every respect inferior to statesmanship. If the premises are correct, the conclusion follows. By the way, the latter thesis is not surprising to us at all. If you take a very popular view today, according to which philosophy is the articulation of the values of a given society, I think one can say that according to a very widespread view, political theory especially is that, the articulation of the values of a given society, say of the American society or whatever it may be. Now what is it? In this case, the philosopher merely articulates what has been laid down by other people, by society. But society is a vague word. Who laid it down? Not an anonymous society. We can trace it back to founding fathers, be it the Declaration of Independence or be it the Constitution. And this way the philosophers would build on a foundation erected by statesmen and would be in the service of political action in which their own work finds its completion. That is the argument with which Cicero starts. He goes on to develop the point that political activity is not only most noble, which in a way he has proven already, but also pleasant. Does this make sense? Sometimes examples are more convincing than any broad argument. At the end of the gathering storm, when Churchill tells the story how he was called to become Prime Minister, he has a sentence which unfortunately I do not know by heart. In this terrible situation in 1940, an incredible responsibility and burden, it was noble by this very fact. Was it only a burden to Churchill? Do you remember what he said? He said that he slept excellently after he got Cicero, because facts are more pleasant than dreams. The fact that he had power, and so political activity, one can understand that political activity is pleasant, and one could say, I suppose, even some lesser political lights would admit that political activity is not at all unpleasant to them. After having established that the political life is superior to the theoretical life, he examines the reasons which are advanced by the opponents of the political life. Now these fellows speak of the labors of political life, compare a reasonable theoretical man sitting in his study and paying his taxes if he has income, but on the other hand is not concerned with other people's business, and he enjoys himself by reading the most wonderful things which were ever written. That seems to be much more attractive than the hustle and bustle of practical life. But it is not only the labor, there are also the dangers, because the dangers indicated by the fact, even in our civilized modern America, that the president is shielded by secret servicemen, whereas people like you and me do not need secret servicemen unless they go to 63rd Street. I say this with a view to a fact which we have had an unfortunate incident in our department. Another point which they also mention is the ingratitude of the citizens, which is also not merely ancient history. I refer again to Churchill's story when he was defeated in 46, was it 46? Yeah? 45. 40. Oh yes, it was no longer in Potsdam, you're right. 45, when he said, he accepted it in good grace. He said that this is a democracy, especially, is ungrateful, and that he could not expect it differently. Cicero replies as follows: the philosophers themselves risk their lives because, for example, traveling. I mean, if you want, a philosopher is used in ancient times in the wide sense, where it means any theoretical pursuit. Now, if you want to learn for certain purposes, you have to travel. Not only in order to speak to other theoretical men who don't happen to live in the place where you live, but also, for example, to see other nations, to see other rivers, other beasts, other plants, and so on. And traveling overseas, and we think of that especially, is very dangerous, as again illustrated by the fate of the Queen Mary now, It was touch and go that even this queen of the ocean arrived safely. I think you read that. Furthermore, there was a terrific gale, the Queen Mary. You haven't read today's paper. Furthermore, the labors are compensated by honor and glory, the labors of the states. And also the joy derived from the recognition of the good outweighs the pain derived from the triumph of the bad. But the most important point is one is obliged to compensate one's country for what it has done for oneself. It has permitted a man to grow, to develop, and he owes it a debt. There is one thing, the necessity to mix with mean people if you go into politics. That, I believe, is as true today as it was in the past. That is at least your opinion, yeah? But Cicero replies, the only alternative to mixing with mean people is to be ruled by them. And therefore it is better to mix with them than to be ruled by them. This argument has a prehistory which some of you may remember. Pardon? Which republic? Since we are reading Plato's Republic. Yes, good. The opponents of the practical life admit that in case of necessity, the wise man will enter politics. Who are they? Do you know any of these wise men? I mean, you don't have to be an antiquarian, there are quite well-known men. That in case of necessity, a wise man would enter politics. Again, Plato in the Republic. He would not enter politics except on the basis of some divine chance, as Plato calls it, but that means necessity. Then Cicero has a powerful argument against Plato. How can he do that properly if he has not trained himself in quiet times, in advance? Is it not absurd to say the wise man should go into politics only in very critical situations where you must already be an old hand and have a sure hand which you can only acquire by experience? And is it therefore not necessary to go into politics as soon as you are properly prepared for it? Cicero continues as follows. This is on paragraph 9 to 10, 11, what we discussed now. The opponents boast of their complete ignorance of political matters, in flagrant contradiction to their admission that in critical situations the wise man would go into politics. Now, who are they? These men who boast of their complete ignorance of political matters, in flagrant contradiction to their admission they would go into politics if there is a really critical situation. Do you remember anyone? Yes? Someone? Oh, Mr. Marie? No. Have you ever heard a writer prior to Cicero, whom you may have read, boasting of his ignorance in politics? Yes? Who did? You nodded.
You mean on our local scene here? Or?
No. Cicero could not argue with a Chicago politician for very obvious reasons.
I'll learn to watch my head.
I see, all right. Yeah. Well, the most obvious statement which occurs to me at any rate is a statement in Plato's dialogue, The Statesman, in which the theoretical man is presented by Socrates. No, I'm sorry, not in the Statesman, the Theaetetus. Nonsense. Oh no, I apologize. It is Socrates who says that. In the dialogue Theaetetus, there is a so-called excursus in which the theoretical life is discussed and presented. And Socrates says here of the theoretical man, apparently with full approval, that he doesn't even know the way to the marketplace. And he doesn't know anything of laws. And he doesn't even know whether his neighbor is a human being or some other kind of animal. That's boasting of ignorance of political matters. Yeah, and of course Cicero rightly says that is absolutely preposterous if the same man demands that people should help their city in a grave situation. How can they make such fantastic claims? I do not go into the question now what Socrates means with this statement in the Theaetetus. I would suspect that it is ironical, but Socrates, that is not a very useful statement because one must always know what is the use of the ironical statement. Plato was, after all, not a joker, a clown. He meant something by it. But here we have the difficulty. Yet Cicero goes on to say, there are philosophers of the highest rank who did not participate in political life, yet studied political science. The name occurs, Scientia Civilis, and thus somehow fulfilled a political function Now, first do we understand that why a student of political science, by this very fact, fulfills a political function? Does this make sense? Do we understand that? I mean, that voting is a political function, everyone would admit. But why should studying political science be a political function? I mean, studying political matters, trying to understand them, is not a hard question.
In studying it, he has to identify the political arena. And in the identification of the political arena is, to me, to be a political function.
Yeah, but what does this word so frequently used now, identify, mean? Do you mean to say that every student of politics must become a member of a party, the Republican or Democratic or maybe the independent voters, or what do you mean?
No, I didn't mean that.
Yeah.
I didn't mean that he had to become a member of a party.
Because that would be wrong.
I have a feeling that I'm involved in learning to identify the political area.
Yeah, but what does identify mean? That word I really don't understand in this connection.
No. When you say you don't understand my term of identification, I feel like I'm out at sea.
Yeah, but then learn.
Or even though that the feeling that I expressed is valid for me.
Yeah, but in other words, do you mean, yeah, but I know that English is not my mother tongue, but I also know that the word identifying in this sense is of very recent use in English. And it has something to do with certain psychological theories about identities and identification.
Well, I think of it in terms of distinguishing the political from the economic.
Why is this a political function? Why do you exercise a political function by understanding political things and doing nothing more but trying to understand? It is really an extremely simple thing. You are, if I may say so, falsely sophisticated. Forgive me in your understanding.
I believe it.
Yeah. It is extremely simple what Cicero means. You have a citizen body in a democracy, and this citizen body is ultimately responsible for the decisions, at least by the act of election. Is it not important that the citizen body is informed rather than uninformed? The political scientist is a man who tries, if he's really an empirical political scientist and not a methodologist, as an empirical political scientist, he tries to become a more informed political citizen than most citizens are. And in this way, he contributes to the raising of the level of the citizen body, because he cannot help, to some extent, spreading that higher degree of information. In a drugstore, conversation comes up, and he can tell people sometimes that it's not so simple as you look. You have your facts wrong, and so on. So that's a very simple thing what he means. Now, if this is done, however, in the most comprehensive way, and Cicero is, of course, thinking here not of people like ourselves, but of Plato and Aristotle, it is really a political function which they fulfill because they give their fellow citizens, and even the citizens of other societies, some help in finding their bearing in political matters altogether. That is a political function. But Mr. Sassini,
I was going to say, that's the argument he uses. It seems to me the argument he uses that if these statements, these philosophers are going to be called on by necessity, then they had better of necessity be prepared, not only be prepared, but by a study of the science of philosophy.
Yeah. That, in other words, what Plato and Aristotle, that in terms comes down to this. For Plato and Aristotle, that is a perfectly defensible position. Yeah? That is a perfectly defensible position because they did not run away from their civic duties. their very study of politics, even if they never acted politically, was a service to the city, to the political society. Yeah.
You're referring then to that activity of the political student, which is, in effect, a political teacher.
Yeah, you can put it way. Informal, yeah.
Yeah.
An informal teacher, yeah. Opinion leader is a word now used. You know, a politically informed man is more likely to be an opinion leader in the desirable sense than a politically uninformed. That, I believe, makes sense. So, here we have reached the end of the introduction. And you see, the end of this discussion is strangely favorable to the philosophers, at least to those philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, who regarded political philosophy as an essential part of philosophy. But still, on the whole, the burden of this argument in the reduction is the practical or political life is much higher than theoretical. Now then, in paragraph 13, the transition to the dialogue takes place. It's on page 29. Where Cicero says in a word that he will report of the conversation on politics, which has taken place about 70 years before, and he knows of it through a certain individual called Rutilius Rufus, whom he and brother apparently had met when they were studying in Smyrna, Asia Minor, and we can assume that this is a piece of fiction, you know. It is utterly unimportant whether it's fiction or not, but I would assume that these things are fiction. And now this, so it is why Cicero did not write the discussion which we shall read is not a discussion by Cicero. It is a discussion by statesmen, say 2 generations before Cicero. And the most famous of them mentioned there is one of the Scipios. The Scipio who conquered Carthage who conquered Carthage and Numantia, a great statesman captain. And Cicero chose him probably for this reason, as it appears from an allusion. Scipio was a very highly educated Roman, at least whatever the standards may have been in Rome at that time. And one of his companions was Polybius. You see? So that's a link up. In other words, it was not that damned foreigner, Polybius, who set forth the doctrine. It's a great indigenous authority, Scipio, who sets forth the doctrine. Now, the discussion begins in the following way. In paragraph 14 to 16, there is the holiday, the Latin holidays, and Scipio is at home. It is a year of the death of Scipio, which is very important for certain things which come later. And then a young man appears called Tubero. And there is first a brief discussion between Scipio and Tubero in paragraph 14 to 16. Tubero comes first because he wants to find out Scipio's private opinion. Whoever has a trace, begin to read. Mr. Sassin, page 31 in that translation.
The last speech
of Tubero.
All right. Well then,
Africanus is a byname of Cicero, of Scipio, because they had conquered Africa, the Africans. Yeah?
Since you gave me a sort of invitation, encouragement you might hope regarding yourself, shall we not first inquire before the others arrive?
That's important, before the others arrive, the private conversation. Yeah?
What the facts are in regard to that second son that has been reported to the Senate. For those who claim to have seen 2 sons are neither few nor untrustworthy. so that we must rather explain the fact of disbelief.
Remember, the fact is established. Therefore, we legitimately ask for the reason. Yeah? Scipio?
How I wish our friend Panaetius were here.
That was a famous philosopher of the generation of Polybius. A quote Stoic philosopher, but a somewhat modified Stoic. We may mention that on other occasions. Yeah?
For it is his habit to make careful investigation of such celestial phenomena, as well as of other matters. But to Barrow, to give you my frank opinion, I do not entirely approve of your friend's habit in all matters of this kind. In dealing with things of whose nature we can hardly get an inkling by conjecture, he speaks with such assurance that one would think that he could see them with his own eyes or actually touch them with his hands. I always consider Socrates to have shown greater wisdom in refusing to take any interest in such matters and maintaining that the problems of natural phenomena were either too difficult for the human understanding to fathom, or else were of no importance whatever to clear life.
Yeah, you see, the discussion of the prologue is continued now, in a somewhat on a higher plane. The criticism of theoretical philosophy, which was originally given merely in the name of political life, is now traced to a philosopher, to Socrates, who allegedly said we should not be concerned with purely theoretical objects, natural phenomena, but only with the right life of man. And this view is taken by the greatest Roman authority useful for Cicero's purposes. Now, in the sequel, Tubular replies, well, that's not true. Socrates was not such a strictly strict moralist. He also dealt with other things. And Scipio says, well, no, I know that better. That's not Socrates, that was Plato, who transform the moralist Socrates into a metaphysician Socrates, which makes this. Which shows, of course, that Scipio was at least reasonably informed about philosophical matters, that he could make such a statement. Then two other men appear, Philus and Rutilius. Rutilius is a man who is the link between Cicero and the whole conversation. Philus will be very important later on because Philus is the academic skeptic. You remember that? Academic skeptic who criticized the doctrine of natural law. He will be very important later. Now, Scipio mentions the fact, here there is a very strange thing. Scipio tells these newcomers what the subject was, this natural physical phenomenon. Now let us see in paragraph 17 on page 35.
After this speech, Scipio noticed Lucius Furius Philus coming in unannounced, and after greeting him with the greatest cordiality, he took his hand and led him to a place on his own couch. Publius Rutilius, who later reported the conversation to us, came in at the same time, receiving Scipio's greeting and was given a place beside Cicero. Well, why are you discussing? I hope our arrival has not interrupted your conversation. Certainly not. But the point which Cicero began to inquire into a short time ago belongs to the very class of subjects which you are always interested in investigating. As for our friend Rutilius, he used to discuss such topics with me occasionally, even under the very walls of the monastery.
Yeah, stop here. Do you see something? Scipio pretended to be a strict Socratic, not to be concerned at all with the explanation of any natural phenomenon. And what do we find out now? That, yes? Yeah, even during on campaigns, yeah, when they had laid siege to Numantia, and they discussed it. So Cicero, as Scipio, in other words, is not as anti-theoretical as he seems. Let me make a remark for the future again with a further argument. The book ends with a dream of Scipio. Scipio tells a dream, this great Scipio. And this is a presentation of cosmology, the whole universe. It is not a myth in the Platonic sense. It is meant to be a presentation of the cosmos. So Scipio reveals at the end, in the form of a dream, the theoretical understanding of the world, which was always there, although in the political, military activity, it did not come to life, and it should not come to life as such. That is gradually prepared. You see, the first step is, no, Socrates was right, only human things are interesting. The second step, oh yes, then while we were bored very much when we had made siege to the city, I was prepared to listen to physical discussions. And later on, we will find soon a very much more serious reason for that. So, in other words, the question of the theoretical and practical life is not settled in Cicero's introduction. It is a subject which keeps the whole book moving. I think that the Cicero's Republic is probably his greatest work from an artistic point of view. And I think we will see that in spite of the fragmentary character of the work. Now, Scipio had discussed physical questions under the walls of Numantia with Rutilius. Pyrrhus is also concerned with these matters. Also Tubalo, as Tubalo, the man who came first and came with this question to Scipio. Now the scene changes again. 5 other men come. Laelius, Mummius, Fannius, Scaevola, and Manilius. The most important of these figures, the names you will easily forget and could forget. The only person who must be kept in mind is Laelius. Because Laelius is a man who presents a naturalogic later on. Laelius is an old Roman lawyer, the chief justice, the most respected authority in matters of law, to whom Cicero Scipio defers. And his central importance is indicated by the fact that when they sit down, Laelius sits in the center. They sit down on a meadow, but it is winter time. And so they can't sit down on any place they wish, they have to seek a special place. What kind of place would they seek in a winter's day? Snow and rain are out of the question, otherwise they couldn't sit outside. What place would they seek? Sunny place, surely. In summer they would seek the shade. Now this is a symbolism which Plato had used in the laws. The laws are discussion taking place on the hottest day of the year, the longest day of the year, a very hot day, and they seek the shade. Here they seek the sun. Now what is the meaning of that symbolism? Seeking the shade, seeking the sun. It's not difficult to guess. Because Cicero's laws, which we shall read afterward, are in a summer discussion. This is a winter discussion. Now what is the difference? What can be the meaning of that difference between sun and shade? What would you expect? Just guess.
Highest truth.
Pardon?
The highest truth.
Yeah, all right. What is the connection?
Sun or light.
Light.
Symbolic.
We seek light. We seek knowledge. Shade, we seek obscurity. Yeah. Good. That's it. So here in this dialogue, as distinguished from the laws, it seeks the sun. In this sequel, in paragraph 19 or so, Laelius states this Socratic view, as we might call it, the view, natural phenomena are none of our business. We limit ourselves to the study of human things, of things which are of concern to us. But he is a very tolerant, a liberal man. He does not object to the discussion of a physical question, especially since there is holiday. You know, there is no grave political or judicial matter before them, and why should he not speak on such an occasion also of physical matters? And Laelius is an educated man. It appears that he knows Plato's Republic very well, and so on and so on. Laelius puts the question very simply as follows. What is the question of the two sons? Is no concern. The question of the two Roman peoples is a problem. Referring to the civil war or the approaching civil war, that was the age of the Gracchi, you know, the agrarian law and all this kind of thing. The Roman people split. This duality of Rome, this is much more important than for a Roman than the duality of sons. That's a simple and respectable position which he takes. But whether it is sufficient is another matter. Now, in the discussion, let us turn to paragraph 23. That is on page 43. It is sufficient to read this single paragraph. The second paragraph on page 43. It is a fragmentary passage.
For I myself a lovely man, and I was aware that he was also greatly esteemed and beloved by my father Carlos. For in my early youth, when my father, then consul, was in Macedonia, and I was in camp with him, I recollect that our army was on one occasion disturbed by superstitious fears, because on a cloudless night, a bright full moon was suddenly darkened. Gallus was at that time our lieutenant, it being then about a year before his election to the consulship. And on the next day, he unhesitatingly made a public statement in the camp that this was no miracle, but that it had happened at that time, and would always happen at fixed times in the future, when the sun was in such a position that its light could not reach the moon.
Yeah, let us leave it at that. You might read tuberose supply still, and then we stop there.
Do you really mean to say that he could convince men who were little more than simple peasants of such a thing, or that he dared even to state it before the ignorant? He certainly did it with great.
Yeah, we say with great success, yeah. Now, what is the point? Scipio tries here to show that the study of natural phenomena is not only a harmless pastime in which you can indulge in on holidays, but that is even very important for the most important political activity, namely war, a panic because of an eclipse of the moon. Then a scientist comes and tells him there is nothing ominous about it. It's as simple as certain motions of bodies here, only these bodies are so big and so luminous, and there is no secret behind it. It's not ominous. And he makes the soldiers better fighters. This is not an eminently good political function. That is, now, I do not, the bearing of this argument is not immediately clear, perhaps. I will try to explain it. According to the older notion classically developed by Aristotle, the highest quality of the statesman is prudence, political prudence. Political prudence has its own principles, which are not derived from any natural science, so that they are known or become known to man in the course of his life and his action. That is the sphere of action, the sphere of prudence, is a kind of a closed sphere. You do not need, except in a strictly subordinate way, other knowledge. For example, you need, of course, all kinds of experts regarding this or that matter, but they have to obey the statesman. They can only advise the statesman, they cannot make decisions. But there is this difficulty, that this whole sphere of prudence may be threatened by wrong theoretical opinions. For example, today, a Western statesman thinking prudentially about what should be done is confronted by the fact that he has opponents who do not act prudentially, strictly speaking. I mean the communists, but men who are guided in their action by a certain theory, the so-called materialistic philosophy of history, or dialectical materialism. Therefore, it becomes necessary for the statesman to face this issue, as Mr. Dulles recommended the reading of the book by Overstreet. You see, that becomes a politically important thing to get informed about that. Something of this kind exists at all times. There are always false theoretical opinions which endanger the prudential handling of human affairs. And there is always, therefore, necessary as theoretical defense of the prudential sphere. Those who know a bit of Aristotle, I believe, will understand what I mean. But not everyone of you knows Aristotle, and perhaps not everyone who knows Aristotle will have understood what I mean, because he may have. Therefore, I would like to find out whether I make myself understood. I'll try to explain this curious concept. What does a statesman have to know? I mean, apart from this obvious fact, he has to know his country, his resources, his enemies, and all other things of his nature. Sure, but he has to know in the first place something which we can regard as utterly trivial, because it is not controversial research. Certain ends, which is for example, the preservation of the United States, the constitutional order of the United States, is surely an end without the acceptance of which no statesman would be alright at this time. Okay? And even the prestige of the United States is a factor which we have already neglect. And so there are other the things which we ordinarily mean by the word the common good, the public welfare, which are ill-defined in detail, but which are clearly enough defined for general orientation. That is a kind of knowledge, the highest form of knowledge, which a statement must possess, because all other things, his selection of means, his assessment of policies, is selected for that given end. Therefore, he does not need theoretical knowledge of the nature of things, in order to be a person citizen. In a complicated society like ours, he must take some expert advice, of course, without all kinds of weapons, business, and so on. But they are not political men, they are simply subordinate, mere advisors of states. So the political sphere seems to be perfectly self-sufficient. That is, I think, the common sense view, and it was the view developed and articulated by others. The point which Cicero or Cicero makes here is this, by implication, by using only this example, that the prudential handling of political matters depends on the fact that the sphere of prudence is not invaded by false theoretical opinions, which make it possible. I take another example. I believe in China they couldn't build railways in certain areas because of certain routes in goats in certain mountains. They must not be chased out of their horns. I have heard this of that. Yeah? Let us assume it was really the common good of China to build the trade, which I don't know, but let us assume that. And then one would, what would be having the difficulty? Wrong theoretical opinion of the schools. Therefore, it would be necessary to enlighten the people. And that means to fulfill a theoretical function, to give to the place of wrong theoretical and right theoretical. And that is the effect of the movement on the thought.
The example that Scipio gives is an example of factual theoretical knowledge. I take it from when you talk discussion nature, later on you're going to lead into the idea that it's not only theoretical knowledge, not only factual knowledge, but moral.
If you come to that, you see the distinction is not made. And the distinction with facts and values doesn't exist. Yeah? I mean, from this approaching from present-day point of view, you would say there's a factual question. And not a question, value question. The distinction is not made. But for reasons which we can clarify to some extent in this course. Yes.
It seems to me there's a certain problem because as regards to self-sufficiency of the sphere, it seems to me you can either make one of two arguments. If you have to call on an expert, but this does not hurt the self-sufficiency of the political sphere, the statesman having to call on the expertise, say,
Yeah.
Why can't the argument be made it is still self-sufficient and able to defend itself? Because in this other matter of theoretical attack, because just as he calls on the economist or the agricultural man, he calls on the philosopher.
Yeah, because, for this reason, because this commonsensical Aristotelian notion of the self-sufficiency of the prudential sphere, yeah, is denied by some people and has been denied by people, so to speak, at all times, you see, and more in modern times than in pre-modern times, surely, but that is therefore a defense is needed. If a man has a philosophy of history, like the communists have, then, of course, in a way, they are not really prudent. They have what they call a tactics, which is their way of prudence, yeah? of prudence. But fundamentally, the whole thing is imprudent because it is based on the premise that they know what the outcome of this development is. Prudence, we can say, is negatively constant by the fact that the future is unknown. Yeah? Yeah? It's unknown. In the moment you assume that there is knowledge of the future, you act on the basis of an entirely hypothetical principle which deflects from prudence. For example, the willingness to reach some compromise in the present case would be greater if the communists were not sure, not as sure as they are, that they will surely win the whole globe for their system. Yeah? Is that clear? I mean, that would, for them, a compromise would be a merely tactical concession. It could never be a genuine peace policy. And I think it shows in infinite varieties of ways. Now let us go on. So you must always see that in the context of the argument, it is a gradual rehabilitation of theoretical philosophy. And the first step is simply, that you need some physics, some natural science in order to prevent panics in your armies, as Scipio knew from his own experience. But Scipio goes much beyond that. In the sequel, in paragraphs 26 to 29, he develops a great theme, which I believe we should read, although it is very late. But it's a very important passage for Cicero's whole outlook. I think we begin on the bottom of page 47.
The things which others may see. Furthermore, how can any man regard anything in human affairs, either as exalted, if he has examined into yonder realms of the gods, or as of long duration, if he has realized the meaning of eternity, or as glorious, if he has perceived how small is the earth, not only the earth as a whole, but especially that part of it which is inhabited by man, and has noticed how we Romans, though confined to scanty portion of it, and entirely unknown to many races of men, hope nevertheless that our name will be borne abroad on wings and will spread to the ends of the earth.
You see how idiotic the assertion is that for the Romans, for the educated Romans, the Roman Empire was the society comprising all men. Yeah? You know, there was a certain notion in the world of a cosmopolis, of a community comprising all men. And people say, well, the Romans identified their state, the Roman Empire, with that cosmopolis, with that universal society. Perhaps there were such fools. Cicero was not one, as he makes clear. He knew, although he had very little geographical knowledge compared with what every school child has today, but he knew that this was not a universal empire, that it was limited to a relatively small part of the globe. Yes.
But as far as our lands, houses, herds, and immense stores of silver and gold are concerned, the man who never thinks of these things or speaks of them as good, because he sees that the enjoyment of them is slight, their usefulness scanty, their ownership uncertain, and has noticed that the violence of men often possesses them in unmeasured abundance, how fortunate is he to be esteemed. For only such a man can really claim all things as his own, by virtue of the decision not of the Roman people, but of the wise, not by any obligation of the civil law, but by the common law of nature, which forbids that anything shall belong to any man, save to him that knows how to employ and use it. Only such a man will consider that our military commands and consulships are to be classed among things necessary rather than things desirable.
And let us stop here for a moment. Here is the word law of nature occurs here for the first time. And here it is used by Scipio. Now what does this law of nature say? The common law of nature. It is distinguished, as it is natural, from the civil law. The example here is this: the property which a man owns belongs to him according to the civil law, to the law of the land. But what does the common law of nature say, as distinguished from the civil law? The civil law says a thing belongs to a man if he has legally acquired it, for example, by inheritance, by purchase, or whichever the legal ways may be, or the gift. But what does the common law of nature say regarding property? A thing belongs to a man who can properly use it. So in other words, a rich playboy, to take a very simple case, has no right to his property. It's illegal. And if the civil law says it is his property legally, that is a very narrow view of the matter. If you think this little thing through, by the way, there is a very good commentary on that, written some centuries prior to Cicero, and one is Xenophon's Economicus, the beginning. And the other is very famous, as Plato's Republic, because that's what Plato implies if he doesn't explicitly teach the Republic. According to the common view, justice means to leave everyone in the possession of what belongs to him, or give him the possession of what belongs to him. What belongs to a man is here presupposed to be defined by the civil law, by the positive law, natural. And here's a great question arises, but what about the positive law itself? The positive law, after all, may be unjust. And therefore, by acting legally, you act in a deeper sense unjustly if the law is unjust. If you radicalize it, as it is done by Plato, by Xenophon, by the Stoics, and by Cicero, who follows them here, the consequence is that there cannot be private property, strictly speaking. That's a simple implication of that. If everyone can own justly only what he can use, that's to say, use well, naturally, use well, and then some wise man who has the judgment on that man must assign to each man what is good for him and what he can use, what he use well. And then, of course, and if he proves to be unworthy of it, he will take it away naturally. There is no private property in this being. That is a simple argument underlying Plato's Republic, developed more explicitly by Xenophon in Economicus at the beginning, and taken for granted here by Scipio. That is a very grave assertion, and it is surely not Scipio's last word, otherwise he could not in decency have been a Roman consul, naturally. But it is a part of the problem. Why is it so crucially important? For the question with which we began, the theoretical and the practical life.
Yes. Is the theoretical question what each person can use? Is the theoretical question what each person can use properly?
No, in itself, in the old sentence, it would be a question pertaining to action. A question pertaining to action. You see, if this is the common law of nature, and no society can possibly live on that, the average society must dilute this highest principle of life by a crude principle which admits private property with all its foolishness and hardship. Then civil society is necessary on a fairly low moral level. Not that you believe that you can change that. I mean, it is essentially. So social life is essentially on a lower level on which thinking. But if that is so, if the whole society, political society, is essentially on a lower level, then the highest form of human life cannot be the political life, but only the theoretical. And that is what Ciccero's whole speech implies, where also the reference to the smallness of even the Roman Empire, not a small city, and other arguments which he makes to Cicero. Let us continue, Mr. Sassin, where you left off.
That they are to be undertaken from a sense of duty and not sought for profit or glory. Only such a man finally can say of himself what my grandfather Africanus used to say, according to Cato's account, that he was never doing more than when he was doing nothing, and never less alone than when alone.
You see, that is a simple expression of the theoretical life, because the practical life consists in action, and consists necessarily in action together with others, political action. Yes?
Well, who can really believe that Dionysius, when by the greatest exertions he deprived his fellow citizens of their liberty, was doing more than Archimedes, one of those citizens, when he made that very blow of which we have spoken, in making which he appeared to be doing nothing? And who does not believe that those are more alone who, though in the crowded forum, have no one with whom they care to those who, when no one else is present, either commune with themselves, or, as we may say, participate in the gatherings of most learned men, finding delight in their discoveries in writing.
Then let us stop here. I mean, you should, I urge those of you who want to have some benefit from this course to read the whole first book. You cannot read the whole thing, naturally, but I can only say, and I believe you will convince yourself in reading that, as Scipio sets forth here, contrary to everything said before, the supremacy of the theoretical life. And in this connection, the term, the common law of nature, occurs for the first time. And we must see later on what the political meaning of this statement is. Common law of nature, we may say, is that law which the wise man, and only the wise man, that as a theoretical man, obeys. What is the use of that natural law for political society? That would be one question. I would like to state only very briefly the sequel of the first book. Laelius requests, Laelius, you know, the lawyer, says the Chief Justice, requests Scipio to tell them what he regards as the best form of civil society, the best regime. And the answer which he gives is this: the best regime is a mixed regime, mixed of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. But Laelius insists on Scipio answering the question which regime he would prefer if he had to accept a simple regime, meaning either monarchy or aristocracy or a democracy. And Scipio answers monarchy. Now he gives, of course, reasons for all these choices which are of some interest, and maybe I do take up some of these points at our next meeting, because after all we must understand that, and it is better we read one a bit less in Cicero and understand something than more and understand nothing. Now, is there any point which you would like to bring up? As I said, I cannot meet this class on Thursday, but from then on I hope to have no interruption whatever. Let me summarize what is going on in the beginning of this work, and what is in a way the theme of the whole book. That is the great question of the relation of the theoretical and the practical life. A question which, of course, must have been a very existential question for Cicero himself, who was a very great statesman, in spite of what some people have said, and also a very great writer. We must never forget that it was Cicero who brought philosophy into Rome in such a way that he made philosophy acceptable to Rome. There had been some other writers, one of them a very great poet, Lucretius, who had written philosophic books prior to Cicero, but they did not bring about the marriage of philosophy and Rome, which Cicero brought about. In this respect, Cicero fulfilled the same function for Rome which Plato fulfilled for Greece. There were philosophers in Greece before Plato, but that philosophy became acceptable, respectable, a part of higher education as a matter of course. That was Plato's merit, as an ancient writer, Plutarch, testifies. And the same, I think, we can say of Cicero. Now, the great question then is the theoretical and practical life, Cicero's most private question, but at the same time, of course, a question which is not only Cicero's question, but a question for every thinking man or woman. And we will take this up, and you will see in the 6th book, in this Dream of Scipio, this whole, Cicero is trying to find a solution more favorable to political activity than, say, Plato's and Aristotle's solution was. But fundamentally, it is the Platonic Aristotelian position, and the whole doctrine is Platonic and Aristotelian. And even this, I have indicated by this example of the common law of nature, the common law of nature, the close connection between that and Plato and Xenophon. As a piece of merely historical information, I would like to say this. We know very little of the Stoics. We have only fragments of them. The first writer who gives us a coherent exposition of the Stoic position is Cicero on the ends of good and bad, but only in moral philosophy. Now, we do know, however, one thing, that the Stoic school emerged out of a school founded by a direct pupil of Socrates. And that was Antisthenes, and the school is called the Cynical school. Now, cynical does not have the meaning which it has today, that's clear, but cynical, and what cynical means, what can one say was the principle? At any rate, the cynical school was an extremely non-political school, let me say. A school concerned entirely with the private perfection and the private life of the individual. It was not, it's in no way an impressive school, but it is of some interest, because it's a crude version of one element of what we have in Plato and Aristotle. A complete rejection of convention in the name of nature on the basis of Socrates. Here, this is one part of this argument. Now, at any rate, the Cynic school somehow prepares the Stoic school. In the current presentation of Stoicism, this cynical origin of Stoicism is, so to speak, completely forgotten. And we must take proper cognizance of it in order to understand the Stoic teaching, because that is the teaching which, within certain limits, Cicero adopted. And that is, as I said at the beginning, the oldest coherent presentation of the natural law doctrine, which we will find in the 3rd book of the Republic and in the 1st book of the Laws. But keep always in mind this question. Today, owing to the current preoccupations underlined by a crypto-Marxism which affects present-day thought very much, people always think of, when they read Cicero, of course, a Roman, belonging to a certain Roman class, the higher class, aristocratic class, and read his books in that perspective. And they do not sufficiently pay attention to the fact that however much Cicero might have been influenced by any Roman and class biases, he was a pupil of philosophers, and in a way himself a philosopher. And we try to take his teaching seriously and try to understand it. It may be wrong, but we cannot even dream of discussing its possible wrongness if we don't have understood it first. And for this purpose, it is necessary to see the great importance which Cicero attaches to the whole question of the theoretical and practical life. And the first discussion, it will go on throughout the book. Now, next time we will have the benefit of a paper by Mr. Kendrick. Yes?